It's NFL Combine Week in Indianapolis. Let's talk about prospects Jets fans should keep their eyes on today on Locked On Jets.
You are Locked On Jets, your daily New York Jets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome. This is the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. It's Monday, February 24th, 2025, and I'm your host, John B. from GangGreenNation.com, wishing you a happy Monday, and thank you for making the show your first listener, first watch every day, and a big shout out to you everydayers. This is a daily podcast covering the New York Jets with new episodes each day through the week, Monday through Friday, and today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Right now, new FanDuel customers can get $150 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. Well, this week, the NFL Scouting Combine takes place in Indianapolis. It is one of the most anticipated weeks on the NFL calendar. As the top prospects descend upon Indianapolis, they will take part in drills later in the week, which tends to get most of the focus. And on today's show, we're going to talk about some prospects Jets fans should have on their radar as the Combine gets underway. Now, the Combine is always a very controversial time because how much stock should be put into it is a matter of great debate in NFL circles. Fans spend a lot of time this year at this time of year debating, should teams really focus on the Combine as much as they do? And I kind of fall somewhere in the middle. Now, I think the Combine has some really, really important parts. In fact, the parts that might be most important don't get discussed. Players will go through medicals, and this is important for players who are coming off serious injuries. How are they recovering? But doctors are also looking for chronic conditions. And unfortunately, sometimes what happens is a player is set to go really high. A player is set to be a high first-round pick, and some sort of condition is uncovered that leads teams to believe that this player's body is just not going to hold up. There also will be one-on-one interviews, which are important on many levels. I mean, if there's a player with quote-unquote red flags for quote-unquote character concerns, that's something that will be addressed in these one-on-one interviews. But beyond that, you're trying to get a sense of who a player is, how, what their work habits are, how quickly they can identify things on film, things that you can't get a sense of unless you speak with them one-on-one. And we don't get the results of these. We only get the results of the drills. So the drills get most of the focus. A lot of people deride this week. They call it the Underwear Olympics. And I will say this. I do think the results are overinflated. I think that we watch players perform on Saturdays in real college games. We watch them produce. And I don't think that it's necessarily the most conducive thing in the world to take a guy who hasn't done anything and then a wide receiver who's done nothing and then runs a 4.3 40 and conclude that he's a great player. I've also seen a lot of guys who are great college players go do poorly at the Combine, see their draft stock fall, get drafted lower than they should, and go on to the NFL and be great players. But I do think there's value in the Combine. And I think really what it comes down to is you have to know what you're looking for. So when we talk about players the Jets fans should keep their eyes on, there are specific things we should be looking for. And I'm going to start by talking about a player at the wide receiver position, Tet McMillan, who is out of the University of Arizona. And at least at this point, and things can change between now and the draft, but at least at this point, he is widely expected to be the first wide receiver off the board. And we have yet to really talk about Tet McMillan much on this podcast, but that will change starting today because he is a fairly popular player going to the Jets at pick 7 in mock drafts. And the reason for that is rather obvious. The Jets are going to have a need at the wide receiver position. Now, they have a good number 1 receiver in Garrett Wilson, who seems likely to stay with the team now. And one of the things we've talked a lot about, Aaron Rodgers' impending departure. One of the things that makes that one of the reasons that this is a good thing is it does make Garrett Wilson's return to the team in 2025 more likely. It was well publicized, through much of the season. Even at the beginning of the season, that there were many points where Rodgers and Wilson were not on the same page. And of course, Rodgers, has his favorites. One of his favorites was Devontae Adams. Another of his favorites was Alan Lazard. And when we got late into the season, Rodgers was kind of force feeding the ball to those receivers, especially Adams, at the expense of Garrett Wilson. So the Jets start from a point where they have a good number 1 receiver. But with Rodgers gone, it makes it very likely that Adams and Lazard will both be cut. And once Adams is cut, not so much Lazard, who did not bring much to the table. Once Adams is cut, the receiver room becomes very thin behind Garrett Wilson. Wide receiver is a premium position in this league, and it's also become a very expensive position. It's very difficult to go out and buy a receiver on the open market because everybody wants a playmaking receiver, which kind of adds an emphasis to finding and developing receivers in the draft. Tet McMillan, again, probably the top receiver prospect, at least at this point in time. But I think this combine is going to be interesting for him. Another aspect of the combine, which is important, is players actually measure in. And Tet McMillan is a big receiver, listed unofficially 6'5", around 210, 212. We'll see how he actually measures it, how he actually weighs and measures in. Sometimes teams in college don't give us accurate measurements, so that's significant. But I think more significant for me, at the wide receiver position, there's a lot of focus on the athletic drills. And to an extent, it makes sense. A receiver is a position where athleticism obviously does matter. You're on the outside, you're one-on-one frequently. But for a player like Tet McMillan, it's important because McMillan is not really a guy who overwhelms you with his athleticism. Okay, he's a big receiver. He's more of a possession type guy. He can win deep, but he's more like a back shoulder guy than somebody who's going to run past defensive backs. But even if speed's not entirely your game, there has to be a baseline of speed if you're going to succeed on the next level. And I think back to 2022, 3 years ago, when the Jets drafted Garrett Wilson. Is Garrett Wilson a guy with blazing speed? Not really, but I think that was one of the questions I had and a lot of people had when he was coming out of Ohio State. Well, Garrett Wilson answered all of those questions at the combine with an absolutely stellar performance. In the 40-yard dash in particular, he ran in the 4.3s, which is very, very fast. Does Garrett Wilson play that fast? Not really. I mean, he's not a guy who runs past corners. He's not a guy who gets deep into the secondary. He's not really much of a deep threat. But I still think that Garrett Wilson's athletic testing, particularly in the 40 3 years ago, was significant because, even if a guy doesn't play as fast as he times, and that's true of many guys. There are lots of guys, you always hear the expression, somebody plays faster than they're timed, somebody plays slower than they're timed. Well, you have to remember, in the NFL, it's very rare that you're running 40 yards straight. There's usually a cut left or a cut right. Somewhere along the way, you're stopping, you're starting. So these aren't always indicative of play speed. But I think the reason Garrett Wilson's 40 time was significant 3 years ago is he may not play at a force 3 speed, but you can't run a force 3 and be slow. You can't really run at that speed and then play slow. So it showed that Garrett Wilson at least had the requisite amount of speed to play in the NFL. And when you add that to his route running acumen, you knew that the odds were high you were going to have a good player. Tet McMillan, a very different type of receiver. He's again a bigger type of receiver, and to the extent he's a deep ball threat, it's more he's a guy you're going to lean on with those back shoulder throws. At least that's how he projects right now. But I think it's important for Tet McMillan, first of all, to show that his measurements to come in as big as we're expecting him to, but maybe more significantly, not necessarily blow us away with the athletic testing, but show that he's got the requisite tools that show that he's fast enough. We were not expecting him to be a guy who runs past everybody. He's not going to be like the ultimate blazer, but just show that he's fast enough. I think that that's significant. And if he does, then he very much becomes a valid option for the New York Jets at 7. Now, during the Locked On Jets podcast, we'll talk about somebody who I hope will be a valid option for the Jets at 7. I'm a little pessimistic about it, though, but that could change depending on, first of all, whether he participates in the athletic drill and how he does on them. This player's on the defensive side of the ball. We'll talk about who it is and what to look for as we continue here on this Monday edition of the Locked On Jets podcast. Today's episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by FanDuel. When the game tips off, the NBA action is just getting started, and there's no better place to get in on it than FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Because with FanDuel, you can place live bets through the game, so even if you miss the opening tip-off or want to bet on a fourth quarter comeback, you can stay in on the action. If you're looking for a bigger payout, you can even combine your live bets into a same-game parlay. You will love using FanDuel's live betting feature because it keeps every moment of the game exciting. Whether you're backing your team for a late-game rally or picking a player to hit a clutch for three, you'll never feel like you've missed your chance. Plus, the app is easy to use, and when you win, you get paid instantly. And right now, FanDuel customers can get $150 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. Just visit FanDuel.com to join today. That's FanDuel.com for your shot at $150 in bonus bets. Make every moment more with FanDuel, the official sports betting partner of the National Basketball Association. Thank you so much for making Locked On Jets your first listener, first watch every day. Big shout out to you everydayers. This is a daily podcast covering the New York Jets with new episodes each day through the week, Monday through Friday. The NFL Combine is this week in Indianapolis. We're talking about players Jets fans should keep their eyes on. Now, the next guy I'm going to mention is somebody I'm not sure is going to fall to 7. In fact, I'm becoming more pessimistic by the day that he'll fall to 7, but still a very intriguing player for the New York Jets, and that's Abdul Carter, who's an edge rusher out of Penn State, a very exciting prospect and a guy whose stock has continued to rise the deeper we've gotten into this process. Abdul Carter kind of began his career in like an off-ball linebacker type role, but has moved into more of an edge rushing type role with Penn State. And when I watch Aaron Glenn's, I'm still like in the stage of evaluating like what Aaron Glenn wants in the defense. I'm still kind of going back through Detroit's trying to break down their defense from a year ago. But one thing we talk about a lot is that the Lions blitz as much as any team in the league, and their blitzes tend to come from the linebacker position. Glenn is not a guy who sends a lot of secondary players from the blitz. There's not a lot of safety blitzes, not a lot of slot corner blitzes. It's usually a linebacker who comes as a blitzer. And I feel like Abdul Carter could be a guy who's an ideal fit in Glenn's defense. Now, how would the Jets use him? It's not entirely clear. I actually kind of lean towards the possibility that Carter would be more of just a full-time pass rusher. And, I think sometimes you do get a little too cute with a guy like Abdul Carter because you see this guy can do everything. He's played both kind of an off-ball linebacker role and a pass rushing linebacker role. So maybe you want to like use him as many different ways as possible, when in reality, there are many cases where the guy's a great pass rusher. Even if he can do other stuff, his most valuable role for your team is just going to be straight up pass rushing. And one of the things that's so exciting about Abdul Carter is that he dominates major conference competition. And it's not that he's completely raw. I mean, you see the makings of some good pass rushing moves, but he's still like kind of figuring it out because he's new to a pure pass rushing role. But you also see moments where, he plays the run as a defensive lineman as though he's a linebacker, where like he's almost like going sideline to sideline. So I think there are a couple different ways he could fit in the defense. I mean, I think in many ways you might not want to overthink it, just make him a full-time pass rusher. But there's also an argument to be made. Maybe you play him in a hybrid type role. When it's blitz time, he gets after the quarterback, and you put 5 guys who are adept pass rushing on the field, and let Carter let Carter fire up the field and use his pass rushing skills there. Use him as kind of like a Swiss Army knife. I'm not sure. So I'm not certain which of the two Aaron Glenn would do if the Jets were able to get Abdul Carter. But again, I think he'd be a very good fit. One of the big questions this week is whether Carter is even going to do the athletic testing drills, because with his stock so high right now, it's like at this point, unless something changes, it might be a lot to ask for him to fall all the way to 7, but he very well might be a player who has more to lose by testing this week than he has to gain. Because if he goes out and has a bad week of testing, maybe he falls off a little bit. And maybe you wait till your pro day, because the pro day is usually in favorable circumstances. And like there are all these little tricks that are there at the pro days that scouts will tell you about. There are some teams where the 40-yard dash at the pro day, because the pro day typically takes place on campus. So Abdul Carter's pro day would be at Penn State. And every major college has a pro day where on campus their prospects take part in athletic drills. And if you speak to the scouting community, there are all these little tricks about how there are some schools where you suspect that their 40-yard dash track is actually going downhill, which helps the prospects out a little bit. And I hate to say this, and I don't want it to come off as mean, but for the Jets, Abdul Carter going out there, And not having a great week, if he decides to test and not having a great week, is the type of thing that could actually benefit them because he's, right now there's actually some buzz now about our Abdul Carter going number 1 overall. And, if he doesn't have a great week of testing, maybe he falls down a little bit. Now, I think this might be a lot to ask. Even a bad week of testing, people can watch the film. And, like I said earlier, when we're talking about evaluating draft prospects, you have to, and you're looking at the combine, you have to understand what you're looking for. And I really don't think there's anything to look for in Abdul Carter because you watch the film of him, he just looks great. And I think back, and this is going back over 20 years. Terrell Suggs, you may remember him as the great defensive end for the Baltimore Ravens. He had a disastrous 40-yard dash time, and it actually dropped him lower in the first round than he should have gone, and eventually Baltimore picked him. He had a great career with the Ravens, and then a little cup of coffee with the Cardinals, and actually a handful of games with the Kansas City Chiefs in 2019 where he earned a Super Bowl ring with the Chiefs. But he's a perfect example of the type of guy whose combine results get overblown because his stock actually took a hit. And he didn't fall that far down. The Ravens still picked him pretty high in the draft, but there was no reason he should have fallen. He was viewed as a top prospect before the combine, and then again had that horrible 40-yard dash, and people wrote him off. And it goes back to something I was saying earlier when you talk about players who rise or fall in the combine based on the 40-yard dash. How many players are you really not interested in? Because if you're playing the defensive end position, you're not really going to run 40 yards in the straight line all that frequently. But sometimes teams overreact, and I think when we talk about the NFL draft process, teams can overthink it. There's so much on the line. Reputations are on the line. Jobs are on the line. It becomes very easy to overanalyze things. Now, I want to make it clear. I'm not saying root for Abdul Carter to do poorly, but this episode's all about players the Jets should keep an eye on. And while there's no guarantee Abdul Carter is even going to participate in the combine, and his agents may well tell him, it's not a good idea because you have more to lose than you do to gain. Some players rise because of great performances. Other players fall because of less than stellar performances. And, there's so much buzz around Abdul Carter right now. Sometimes the momentum plays a role when there's nothing but good news about a player. He played through a really painful injury in the Orange Bowl loss to Notre Dame and was dominant, may have been the best player on the field in that game. It's worth keeping an eye on how he does it this week. If he hits it out of the park, which he likely will, then, he might very well be out of the Jets' range. If he doesn't, at least it may put him back in play, and he might be a player worth watching for the Jets at 7 as we get deeper into this draft process. Now, here on the Locked On Jets podcast, we'll talk about some other players. There are a couple of other guys worth keeping an eye on who could affect the Jets directly or indirectly. We'll talk about who they are continuing here on this Monday edition of the Locked On Jets podcast. This is the Locked On Jets podcast on this Monday. We're getting ready for the NFL Combine. We're talking about some players Jets fans should keep their eyes on this week as the NFL Scouting Combine comes to Indianapolis, one of the most anticipated weeks each year on the NFL calendar. Now, should it be? Well, that's a matter of interpretation. I think there's a guy out of Alabama who could be intriguing. Now, probably not for the Jets at 7, but this is a guy who could come into play if the Jets either trade down or if they trade up from their pick early in the second round, and that's Jihaad Campbell out of Alabama. Now, he's a linebacker. He also has experience, though, as an edge rusher. And, in Aaron Glenn's defense, he wants linebackers who kind of do it all. He wants guys who can shed blocks. He wants guys who can play the run. But, as we mentioned earlier, Aaron Glenn also blitzes his linebackers. Aaron Glenn's a big blitzer as a defensive architect. Now, we know Steve Wilks is coming in, but Steve Wilks, outside of his tenure with the San Francisco 49ers, where he was kind of running the defense Kyle Shanahan wanted him to run, and Kyle Shanahan is known for being a guy who hires defensive coordinators who play lots of coverage, lots of four-man pass rush, lots of zone coverage, and other stops along the way. In his career, Steve Wilks has been a guy who's blitzed a lot. And I think that the Jets will be a heavy blitzing team, but again, I don't think they're going to blitz a lot from the secondary. I don't think you're going to see a lot of corner or safety blitzes. I think you'll see a lot of linebacker blitzes. So that's where a guy like Jihaad Campbell could come into play. And Jihaad Campbell's expected to do very well at the combine. I don't know that he's going to rise his stock high enough to get up to 7, but again, a scenario where the Jets trade back, and that seems plausible. You have a first-year GM, a first-year head coach who are probably thinking longer term, which is completely different for where the Jets have been the last couple of years, where the Jets have been all about the here and now. And when you're thinking longer term, I think you're more likely to try and trade back, accumulate extra picks. And Jihaad Campbell could be a guy who really fits what the Jets do well. And I would expect that there's a good possibility that, he'll do well at this combine and improve his stock. Another guy, a guy I'm not a big fan of, who I've talked about on the show, a couple of times. I just mentioned him on Friday, Tyler Warren out of Penn State. Now, Tyler Warren's not necessarily a guy I think is going to be in the mix for the Jets. I really have a tough time seeing them drafting a tight end as early as Warren will go. But indirectly, I think there could be an impact here, because we all know what Brock Bowers did this past year. And sometimes NFL teams can't help themselves. Sometimes NFL teams see somebody have success doing something, and they decide to be copycats. And I think after what happened with Brock Bowers this past year, where he went to the Raiders and had such a big rookie season, there's probably going to be a team out there that's going to be really tempted by Tyler Warren. And I think Tyler Warren's a very good prospect. I have absolutely nothing against him. But I do think maybe some team's going to take him a little too high. And I don't think that he's quite on the level of a Brock Bowers as a prospect. I think that if he does very well at the combine, if he does better than expected at the combine, maybe he moves higher. Maybe he moves higher than where the Jets pick, and maybe he drops more realistic prospects down to the Jets. So I think he's another guy worth watching. One more guy I'll give you, Mykel Williams, an edge out of Georgia, a guy who is kind of like a physical specimen right now. And this is another guy who I think is going to do very well with the athletic testing at the combine. And I think he's a guy who could raise his stock. Again, maybe not to 7, but in a scenario where there's a trade down involving the Jets, maybe he could be an option. This is like many guys many guys who come out of Georgia, not a finished product. You may remember Walker a few years ago, who the Jaguars picked number 1 out of Georgia. Georgia's a bit tricky. They have excellent coaching there, but their scheme kind of does not allow guys to develop into stars. Georgia, it's very much like kind of like a do your job type situation. The defensive linemen are first focused on, controlling their gaps. It's not necessarily about, getting up the field and posting big stats. And so you've seen this a lot, where a lot of their pass rushers at the defensive end position, a lot of their edge guys don't necessarily come out ready to produce in the NFL. Mykel Williams, we'll see how he measures. Now, officially with the Georgia team site, he listed at 6'5", 265. So good size for for an edge rusher. A guy who I think needs some refinement as a pass rusher, but a guy who, probably is going to come out and have a big combine. And if he does have a big combine, again, he can improve his draft stock. Maybe not all the way up to where the Jets are drafting, but he's a guy who could become viable in a trade down scenario. And I think that we should be taking trade down scenarios seriously, just from the standpoint, again, a new regime in town, guys who are going to be, probably thinking long-term more than Robert Saleh and Joe Douglas have been the last couple of years, with Aaron Rodgers in the mix. And of course, there are other players to keep an eye on this week. But if we're talking about where the Jets are in the first round, I think that's where most of the focus is at this point. And of course, there are other players who will go later in the draft who are very important for this team. But some guys worth keeping an eye on. I think these are really the names to watch if you're a Jets fan in Indianapolis this week. Anyway, that's all for today's episode of the show. This has been the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day is our motto. As always, if you enjoy this show, please hit the subscribe button where you're watching or listening so that you'll never miss an episode. If you enjoy the show and are listening on a podcast source, please give it a 5-star review. And if you're watching on YouTube and enjoy the show, please give this episode a big thumbs up. It helps us out and helps other Jets fans find the podcast. Hope you have a wonderful Monday, everybody. Hope you have a great start to your week, and we'll be back tomorrow to talk more Jets.